Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. With the events that are going on in our world, in our news now every day, i.e. The conflict that's going on in Russia and Ukraine, or Russia with Ukraine, that once again is coming to the forefront of people's thoughts and minds and wondering, what does this mean? Does the Bible have anything to say about it? So in this session, I'm going to go over elements of the geopolitical background of the conflict, which most people would not be familiar with. And then in the main session, I'm going to go over some Bible prophecy, and I'm going to show how when Yeshua was asked, what's the sign you're coming in of the end of the age, the answer that he gave in Matthew 24 is a parallel of Revelation 6. And the main point of showing you that is because for those of you who know me over the years, I teach about what we call the Greater Exodus and how we're a part of the Greater Exodus and what that is and what is the timing of it. So the teaching at the main session is to give you some details about understanding timing of end-time events, all right? So it's been said that in war, the first casualty of war is truth, because each side of the war is trying to put forth their narrative to rally their people around that narrative. So I would like to give you some factual, historical background so we can more fully understand what are the issues that are driving the conflict. And this conflict, I believe, very much has the potential, if it spins out of control, to result in World War III. And in the main session that I'm going to give next, when I'm talking about Revelation chapter 6, I'm going to put forth the possibility that the white horse of the four horses of the apocalypse is the coronavirus in the vaccine. And if that is the case, time will prove it, whether it's the case or not, that if that's the case, then quite possibly we may be, with the Ukrainian conflict, we may be starting the red horse. So that's the urgency to share this message today. All right, so because basically what I have to share is a number of years ago, a few years back, I did a weekly blog. And the blog site was watchmanofzion.com. I stopped doing that blog 2017, but there was issues regarding Russia and Ukraine back in 2014. And what was happening in the conflict in 2014 was connected to what was going on in Syria. And so in order to give an explanation of how the two were connected, I put forth a blog of the information which I am now going to, as much time as I have, to read and share with you. But because I did this for my local congregation, and reading through everything takes probably a little bit more time than what we have, I want to make sure that before I start that I share with you, in essence, the points, the main points that I wanted to make, so that if we don't go through all the details, you'll at least know the main points, that the details are trying to make. And so that being the case, here are the issues regarding the conflict. Is going back when the Berlin Wall fell, that ultimately the primarily Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, which were under Russian control and influence, when they fell, ultimately, and I believe, I saw an article here recently, that there's been 13 of those countries that since that time has joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which in essence functions as Western Europe's block of partnership against foreign threats and other things. And so a number of the countries that was under the influence of Russia from World War II and the Cold War have joined itself with Western Europe, and the United States joined itself with NATO. And ultimately, for example, the Baltic states, but the primary country is the Ukraine, that NATO stretch and control is working itself toward, in some instances, is on Russia's border. And because NATO can bring in whatever defense things that it thinks that it needs, either against Russia or to point toward Russia, Russia is feeling uncomfortable regarding those weapons so close to its borders and, in essence, pointed at its cities. And secondly, in addition to that, is in order for Russia to have a waterway out, it needs the Black Sea. So Ukraine comes up against the Black Sea, and if Ukraine was a part of NATO, which currently it's not, if it was a part of NATO and linked itself with the West, then basically Russia's landlocked. So that NATO's up against its border, and it doesn't have a way out to send its goods and other things out by water. It wouldn't have access to the Black Sea. So Russia is feeling like it's being penned in and backed into the corner. And ultimately, the West wants Russia to join with the West. And in how the European Union and how they want America to be is the globalists don't like individual national sovereignty. They desire for each country to give up its individual national sovereignty. That's why the European Union, a lot of its decisions are being made in Brussels for the countries that are a part of the European Union, and a part of losing your individual control is not having control over money. And so a number of years back, there's no longer a French franc. There's no longer a German mark. Many of the countries in NATO now operate and use the euro. And so if they want to step away, if they don't like what's going on, well, they got to make their own currency. It's going to create economic upheaval. So in joining, you are committing yourself to allow higher authorities to have power and control over you, so that it would be very costly if you wanted to break away. And so they wanted Russia to be a part of that system. Ultimately, Russia to give up its national sovereignty and to give up any of its culture and adopt all the Western values in the Western culture, which involves what some people would regard and consider as moral things as well. So Russia has not been willing to do that. So the second issue that plays a part in the conflict is energy, and particularly natural gas. And when I wrote this article, what I saw from the information I resourced was about 25% of Germany's and Europe's natural gas that they use, particularly in the winter, to heat their homes, it comes from Russia. They are dependent upon Russia for their energy. And one of the ways in which that energy gets to Europe is pipelines through the Ukraine. And so in the past, when there's been disputes Russia's had with Europe for one reason or another, temporarily they shut off the pipelines. And so Germany in Europe would prefer to not to be under the control of Russia and dependent upon Russia for their energy. And so the largest natural gas reserve in the world is in the Gulf. And I believe it borders Iran and Qatar. And what Europe wanted is they wanted that natural gas to come to Europe. And the most convenient way to get it there is through Syria. And so they went to Assad and said, hey, we want to put a pipeline through Syria so that we can get energy over to Europe to basically be less dependent upon Russia, who's taken the natural gas through the Ukraine. And Assad said no. And so when Assad said no, the West ultimately organized an uprising against Assad to get him out of office so they would get somebody in there who would allow the pipeline to go through. And that was all about these years of the Syrian conflict that we used to hear about regularly, but we don't hear so much about anymore. And quite often, the way the United States tries to achieve its objectives in foreign countries, quite often, not exclusively, is they work through third parties so that they're not directly linked per se, and so overtly being seen that they are trying to get rid of a government and put in a government that they want. And so part of the reason for permitting, for example, ISIS, is because ISIS was another entity to possibly bring down Assad in Syria, because the United States didn't care who did it. They just wanted him removed. And so they allowed ISIS to get oil revenue and stuff, and allowed their fighters to be part of the entities that were fighting against Assad to bring him down. So because the conflict in Syria was about natural gas, it was about energy and dominance, Russia felt that it was in its interest to go into Syria and to protect Assad so Assad wouldn't be removed from power. So that issue was all about energy. It was about natural gas. And natural gas and NATO are two of the central things that's being fought over in Ukraine as well. And so since the Syrian conflict started, Israel discovered a very large natural gas reserves right off their coast in the Mediterranean, and Israel is in discussions to send that natural gas to Europe, which would also be a way of bypassing Russia as well. So perhaps one of the reasons for the Gog-Magog invasion of Israel, that will be sometime in the future, perhaps an element of that is the same issue that's going on in Ukraine with natural gas, is wanting to have control of those natural gas fields as well. So it's about NATO, the role of NATO, NATO's expansion. It's about energy, and of course, those two things are about power, dominance, and control. So wars are fought over power, dominance, and control, and wars are fought over economic issues. So energy is an economic issue. And so that is the big picture of what is going on. And then, back in 2013 into 2014, the Ukrainian president at the time was friendly toward Russia. And the Ukrainian president at the time signed, or was in the process of signing, an economic cooperation agreement with Russia and a few other states partnered with Russia. And when that was done, the West, the United States, did not want Ukraine to be economically partnering with Russia, because they would lose the influence of the Ukraine, and they would lose the possibility of Ukraine being a part of NATO. And so as a result, through third parties, there was the creation of an uprising against the Ukrainian president, who was aligned with Russia at the time, and he got disposed from power. And that was in early of 2014. So then they had new elections, and in the new elections, a pro-Western, a pro-NATO person got elected to be the Ukrainian president. And then what he did was he rescinded the agreement with Russia, and then continued to pursue a partnership with Europe in partnership with NATO. So when that happened, given how Ukraine is, it's a large country, and the western side of Ukraine is more toward and connected with Europe. But the eastern side of Ukraine is more connected toward Russia. Eastern Ukraine speaks Russian. Western Ukraine speaks Ukrainian. And so when the pro-Western, pro-NATO Ukrainian president got elected in 2014, after the previous Ukrainian president that was friendly toward Russia got removed through the revolution, that then the pro-European Ukrainian president, the people in eastern Ukraine got concerned that they would be persecuted. They would not be represented. And so there was a couple regions, a couple republics in eastern Ukraine who started an uprising against the pro-Western elected government, because they was afraid that the government would basically treat them as second class and not permit them to live according to their cultural upbringing. And Russia supported that uprising because the regions or the republics in eastern Ukraine that were now rebelling, that they're more closely aligned with Russia. Furthermore, Russia being concerned that perhaps the direction of Ukraine would be that they would join NATO, that Russia was concerned that it would be locked out from having access to the Black Sea, and they then ended up in 2014 annexing Crimea. When Russia annexed Crimea, Europe and the United States says, hey, Russia, you're going out of bounds. You can't be doing this. And so what Europe did immediately, now this was the summer of 2014. So I don't know if you remember because it's over 7 years ago, but 2013, 2014, you were paying $4 a gallon for gas, which you're paying now. Oil prices was what they are now, $100, $110 a barrel. Okay, so roughly 50% of Russia's income comes from selling energy, oil, natural gas. So if you were going to punish Russia for saying that they want Crimea now to be a part of Russia, if you want to punish Russia, if you want to punish them economically, and 50% or roughly 50% of their revenues come from energy, how would you punish Russia? You would drop the price of energy. You would drop the price of oil. That means they get 50% less revenue. So, would you believe, supposedly we have a free market? In the West, we kind of are told or thought that we have a free market. We're told what the markets are doing every day. Well, if you owned oil and if you own natural gas, would you decide that today you're going to sell it for this price, but 6 months later you're going to sell it for 50% less? If you have the oil? Well, guess what happened to the price of oil from summer of 2014 to January 2015? Guess what happened to the price of oil? Well, this is what happened to the price of oil right there. So you see in July of 2014, the price of oil was $110 a barrel. 6 months later, in January 2015, it was $50 a barrel. The price of oil dropped 50% in 6 months. Does the free market got to cause the price of oil to drop 50% in 6 months? But we were all happy. You know why? Because starting in January 2015, you know what you're paying at the pump now for gas? $2. You're paying $2. And you've been paying $2, $2.50, $2.75. You've been paying $2 since January of 2015 until Biden took office. Why are we paying $2? Well, because they wanted the price of oil to be low to punish Russia for going into Crimea as a response to the newly elected Ukrainian president in 2014 who came to power from the previous Ukrainian president that was pro-Russian who got removed from power by third parties that were supported by the United States and Europe. Okay, so now, do you got what historically happened when sanctions were put on Russia to punish Russia? Do you see what historically happened? The price of oil came down 50% to punish Russia for what they did to Crimea. Now we're putting sanctions on Russia to punish Russia for what they're doing in Ukraine. And what's happening to the price of oil now? Well, wait a second. If we're punishing Russia in 2014 for what they're doing and oil went down 50%, why are we punishing Russia now and the oil's going up? I mean, if you're punishing them, both times they should go down. If you're punishing them, both times they should go up. So why then did it go down, and why now is it going up? So the answer ultimately is there's an agenda behind the price of oil. And so what was the agenda back in 2014-15? It was to punish Russia's economy. Now, is that an agenda today? Yes, it is. So in that regard, punishing Russia's economy is the same. But while we're trying to punish Russia's economy today, oil prices are going up because there's another agenda going on, in my opinion. And do you think it was an accident that when Biden came in, he says, okay, the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to shut off the Keystone Pipeline. So roughly what we would have gotten from the Keystone Pipeline operating, which Trump was in favor of, what we would have got from it being operational is roughly the same as what we started to import oil from Russia. And so energy is fundamentally behind the price of goods. And so that was a decision that you would know is going to cause prices to go up. Because now if truckers were paying $3 for diesel, and now they're paying $5 for diesel, they're going to pass the costs along, and everything that the truckers move is going to go up. And so it creates the inflation. Okay, so it appears to me that inflation wasn't a byproduct of someone stupid and ignorant and not knowing about economics. It was a political decision that they want inflation. So why would they want inflation? Have you ever heard of the Great Economic Reset? Okay, you know what the Great Economic Reset used to be called? It used to be called the New World Order. But that term was used for so long, people got caught on to it, so that now they had to use another term so that people wouldn't necessarily be able to make the connection that was before. And so, for example, they used to call it global warming. You know, the planet is, the temperature of the planet is going up, and it's hurting the environment. But then we would have times when we have these bad winters and things would get really, really cold, and it didn't make you so look good when you're calling things global warming, when things would get drastically cold in the winter. So they had to change the terminology. It's not global warming. It's now climate change. And of course, does anyone look at the weather report? I mean, I look at the weather report, and you know, at least where we live here, I live in Ohio, you live in Indiana, we have 4 seasons. And so you know what happens in the 4 seasons? The climate changes. It changes from winter, and then it changes to spring, and then it changes to summer. In the summer it's hot, in the winter it's cold. You see, the climate changes. So if anyone has any dispute about climate change, you know, you have to be stupid and ignorant, because are you going to try to argue that the climate doesn't change? So they changed the language, and so now they're using the language of the Great Economic Reset. So you know what fundamentally the Great Economic Reset is? It's a new economic system. So what system, or the system that we currently have, is the system that we've had that was set up from World War II. And the system was, I think, back in 1944, called the Bretton Woods system, and that's where that's our present economic, monetary system that the West has been using from then until this day. And then I believe it was Henry Kissinger went to visit the Saudis, I think maybe in the 70s, made an agreement with the Saudis. We will buy your oil, but you have to use U.S. dollars to buy the oil. And so because basically oil is traded in dollars, everybody has to have dollars in order to buy oil. And so in essence, the dollar is what they call the reserve currency. And what still maintains the dollar's value in part is because it is the reserve currency. And so the United States has been used as a base of operations, both its dollar-denominated economic power and its military power since World War II, to be the agent by which the rest of the world, who after World War II was, brought down, brought low, that the rest of the world would be built up basically as the United States chooses, and as they promote other countries, and then through international organizations that were ultimately created, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc., that when these other countries would get loans, they would make conditions. Oh, you have to have your country be this, that, and the other. And so there was this individual who was a part of the Carter administration, who was a part of the founding of, in 1973, the Trilateral Commission, an organization created through David Rockefeller, that he wrote a book in 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1970, called, I believe it's called Between Two Ages, or something like that. And basically the main point that book made was, now he's writing this in 1970, okay, this is 50 years ago, is we have to bring down the standard of living of the United States, and we need to bring up the standard of living of Russia, so that ultimately we can merge the two in what was planned to be one day, one world government. And so that philosophy that Brzezinski wrote about did not get applied to Russia. That philosophy got applied to China, because in 1971, Nixon goes to China and opens up China, and China and the Asian countries ended up being the primary countries that the West traded with. And ultimately, over the years, now the economies of Asia, the economies of China was just a whole bunch of peasant people that were poor after World War II, the 50s and 60s, etc. And so we bring up the standard of living of China, we bring up the standard of living of Asian countries, like Singapore and other countries like that. Meanwhile, it makes everybody happy, because the international businesses, they're now able to get cheap labor, and now they're able to ship back their goods back where the money is for people to buy it, in Europe and the United States, with free trade. And now they sell it to you at increasingly higher prices because you'll pay credit for it. So it makes big profits for the companies. It makes the stock market go up. And so everyone can say, oh, the economy's doing great. Look how well the economy's doing great. The stock market's going up. Meanwhile, what it's doing in the long term, it's bringing down ultimately the standard of living in America, and it's bringing up the standard of living in Asia, so that ultimately we get to the point like today where it becomes more possible for things to be merged. And so in '73, David Rockefeller organized this entity called the Trilateral Commission. So the tri in Trilateral Commission, the tri was North America, Europe, and in essence Asia. And the country that was being worked with in 1973 in Asia was Japan. And so the plan was, in order to bring about one world government, you had to first regionalize the world, and then once the different parts of the world are regionalized, then you merge those regions. It'll be easier to merge the regions to have one world government. So where they have been the most successful at in regionalizing is Europe, because we have a European Union, where individual countries in Europe, France, Germany, etc., they gave up their individual country rights so that we're following European policies, and European decision makers are making decisions for Europe. And you want to know the reason why we don't have a southern border is because they don't see that there is a border. Because they see that there's a North America Union, and they see that just like the European Union is one entity, North America is one entity. Canada is one entity with America, one entity with Mexico, and it doesn't have borders. So if you're trying to say they're borders, you're emphasizing individual national sovereignty, which is against what they're trying to do. They're trying to regionalize. And so, I mean, that's the reason why there's open borders, is because of the policy goals, okay? So then the idea was you would do the same thing in Asia. Well, Asia kind of didn't really catch on, okay? Who caught on the most was Europe. And so it's been this ideal that ultimately in the process of time, that the Western system, since World War II, it would have to collapse so that there would be need, and the world would be ready for the new system. So the new system would be one world government and a currency that's behind that one world government. So that currency in the age of computers is now desired to be a digital currency. So what did Biden just sign as an executive order? To explore now that we have a digital currency. So it appears to me that the Western globalists that run Europe, that run the United States, they feel as though they're closer and more ready for this transition. That the Western system that's been operational since World War II, that it would be replaced by this new global system. One world government and one world currency. And so that's what the transition to that is what they're calling the Great Economic Reset. So now they have to have a rational explanation to the masses who really don't follow these things in detail. They're too busy living their own lives and raising their kids and taking them to school and taking them to the games and stuff like that. That's how we spend our lives, working 40 hours a week and paying our bills. And you're frankly, life makes you too busy to follow all this other stuff that's going on. I mean, it's a challenge enough just to raise your family and to keep the household going and stuff like that. And so most people, the majority of people, are not able to follow these external events and piece everything together. And so that's why they can sell you media-wise on emotion, and they can sell you on a particular narrative, which is what's going on at the time. And so I believe, I don't know how long the process would be, I don't know how long the process that they're planning, I don't know what disruptions are going to be, but it appears to me like they made a political decision when Biden came in, to begin the process of creating inflation, to create the conditions ultimately so that our present system would collapse, the dollar would collapse, so they can bring in the Great Economic Reset. So while they're really planning it and desiring it and they've wanted it for years. They've wanted it longer than what I've been alive. They've been working on it longer than what I've been alive. They don't want to be blamed for it. And so, therefore, I forget who made the statement, is, don't waste an opportunity that you might have in a crisis. Don't let a great crisis go to waste, something like that. Okay, so they're not gonna try to let this Ukrainian crisis go to waste. So therefore, while they are saying they're opposing everything that Russia is doing, I think alternatively, they wouldn't say it publicly, but alternatively, they really don't mind what's going on if it will contribute to economic problems, that the Western dollar system can collapse so they can bring in the great economic reset, because they're actually in favor of the great economic reset, but they don't want to be blamed for the failure of the existing system. So if we can blame it on inflation, if we can blame it on Russia, if we can blame it on Putin, the majority of the people will think that that's how it happened. And now we just need to go forward with our new world. Now, all of this plays into Bible prophecy, because I believe Revelation 13, where you have the rise of the beast that rules for 42 months, I believe for a long time in teaching Bible prophecy that beast that rules for 42 months is the new system. It's one world government with one world currency. And the currency element of it gets played out that no one may buy or sell unless they endorse the system. So, you know how now you're sort of told that you got to endorse the system? If there's mandates, you got to endorse the system. You can't oppose the system. You're a rebel. If you're a rebel, if you lose your job, so what? So like when they're running for office, we need to create economic opportunity. We need to create jobs. We need to create good jobs. But if it's over a vaccine and you lose your job, well, so what? So now they don't care about your job anymore. Okay, so this is all playing into Bible prophecy. Because if the prophecies are going to be fulfilled, this is the way it happens in our natural world. And so I'm going to be going over in the next session Matthew 24, how it's related to Revelation 6, and the possibility that we have already started the four horses of the apocalypse, the possibility that the white horse is the coronavirus and the vaccine. And if that ends up proving to be true, only time will tell, that we could be starting the red horse. So how long have we had the white horse so far, if that indeed is the case? 2 years. But it hasn't gone away. It's still going to go. But it seems like we're starting a new season, the red horse season. How long is the red horse season? I don't know. Is it 6 months? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? I don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out. What's going to happen in the Ukraine? Is Russia going to take control, or are they going to be repelled? And is China going to go after Taiwan? If they do, when? How? And if they do, is that going to cause North Korea to go against South Korea? If they do, when, how? And if that happens, is that going to cause India to go after Pakistan? Is that going to cause Iran to go after Israel? So there's things that could happen, but we don't know when, we don't know how long, and in our natural world, it's dependent upon circumstances. And so the red horse. Well, if you take the red back to the Torah, the red is Esau. Esau was red, Genesis 25. He came out hairy all over, and he's associated with red. Okay, so what do we historically call Russia? Red Red communist Russia, red China. Okay, so could the red horse be Russia, China? Because actually Russia and China are partnering now. China has not opposed Russia in what they're doing. At the United Nations, they voted to abstain. So there's these countries. I got 2 minutes. So they've been trying to create an alternative bloc to the Western system. It's called the BRICS nations. You heard of that? 2009, 2010 is when the BRICS nations were really trying to bring things together. BRICS, B, Brazil, R, Russia, I, India, C, China, S, South Africa. So those nations were trying to partner to create an alternative economic system to the Western economic system. They haven't really so far accomplished their goals. But in the vote about condemning Russia for what it's doing in the Ukraine, I wasn't able yet to follow to see how Brazil voted, but China abstained. India abstained. South Africa abstained. So they're not really opposing. So we are in this east-west battle. And Russia and China is not opposed to a new world order. They just want to be the ones in charge. The West is not opposed to a new world order. They just want to be in charge. So now the fight is over who's going to be the king of the hill of the new system. And East is fighting West. And where it's being manifested right now, where East meets West, is Ukraine. And so that's what the conflict is all about. Those are the issues. And actually, me verbalizing it, I was supposed to give you my overview. And so I'm out of time now. But that's actually better because all the details would have bored you. But the point is, what I've shared with you now is the interaction of things and what's going on. So I hope that will help you to better understand what's going on in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, how it's tied to Bible prophecy. And we'll expand on that in the main session when I talk about how Matthew 24, Yeshua's answer about the sign you're coming in the end of the days, is related to Revelation 6 in the 6 seals, and the timing of things that lead up to Messiah's return in the Great Tribulation. All right? So thank you for allowing me to share in this session, and I look forward to sharing again in the main session.